let me ask you something. When something goes wrong on your PC, who do you think is in control? I'm not talking about everyday use. I mean when update fails, when the system doesn't start, when you reinstall Windows expecting to start clean. In those moments, most people think the same thing. This is my computer, I'll fix it. With Windows 11, that doesn't always work the way people expect. There are times now during setup, recovery, or reinstall where Windows pauses and asks for verification before it lets you move forward. That's where things start to feel different. So the question isn't about performance or features. It's simple. When something breaks, who decides what happens next? Well, here's the thing. When you install Windows today, the setup has a very clear order, and it's not the order a lot of people remember. Very early on, it wants you connected. It wants you sign in. That part comes up before you really had a chance to choose much of anything else. That wasn't how Windows 10 worked. Back then, signing in was encouraged, sure, but it didn't block the whole process. Local accounts were right there. You could finish installing Windows, get it to the desktop, and decide later how much you wanted tied to an account. Now, the choice shows up much earlier. If you follow the normal path, everything looks fine. Setup finishes, the computer works. Most people never think twice about it. But the order matters. Over time, Microsoft has been closing off the easy ways people used to delay the sign-in step. Some ways still exist, but they are harder to reach and easier to lose after updates. You usually only hear about them if you go looking. That's different from Windows 10, where setting things up locally wasn't a trick. It was just a part of the process. What Windows expects now is simpler to describe. It wants to know who you are before it lets the rest of the setup continue. That information doesn't come later anymore, it comes up front. From Microsoft's side, the reasoning isn't mysterious. When machines are set up this way, everything lines up faster. Sync is ready, recovery options are already connected. Supporting lots of computers becomes easier when they all start the same way. To be honest, I get why they went in that direction, but it doesn't change which setups feel natural and which ones feel like exceptions. Local-only setups still work, but they are no longer what the process is built around. You can use them, but the system isn't really designed with them in mind anymore. That's the difference between how Windows 10 handled setup and how Windows behaves now. And when that goes away, the rest of the experience go with it. After a system has been running for a while, control shows up in ordinary places. Updates are one of them. On Windows 10, updates were part of the background, but the timing usually stayed flexible. Restart later generally meant later. Pausing updates worked in a predictable way. If something was in progress, the system tended to wait. Windows 11 handles that differently. Updates still allow delays, but the limits are tighter and less consistent. One update cycle might give you room, the next one pushes harder. You do not always know how much choice you have until the system decides it is time to move forward. That changes how you relate to the machine. You start watching update behavior instead of assuming it will stay out of the way. Settings add to that. With Windows 10, changing a setting usually settled the matter. You could move on and not think about it again. The system rarely revisited those choices on its own. Now, some settings return after updates, others get moved. A control you remember adjusting is still there, but not where you expect it to be. You end up checking things that used to stay settled. At least in my case, that meant paying attention to the system in places I never had to before. Not because something broke, but because changes did not always stick. That raises a practical question. If a setting can be undone later, how permanent is the choice in the first place? Nothing here prevents the computer from working. Software runs, files open, daily tasks continue, but maintaining control becomes an ongoing task instead of a one-time decision. Windows 10 approached this differently. Once the system was configured, it mostly stayed that way unless you change it. Windows now revisits decisions more often and is more comfortable adjusting things after the fact. Those adjustments are small, but they accumulate. Over time, you find yourself checking, confirming, and reapplying choices that used to stay put. This is the kind of change you only notice after living with the system for a while. I keep coming back to one thing when I think about all of this, and it's not performance or features. It's what happens when something goes wrong and you're the one trying to put the system back together. With Windows 10, at least the way I experience it, ownership and control usually pointed to the same place. If the machine was mine and it was sitting in front of me, the assumption was simple: I get to decide how it gets fixed. It might take time, it might be annoying, but the authority stayed local and the system treated that as normal. Windows doesn't always make that assumption anymore, and that surprised me when I first ran into it. More of what Windows relies on now is tied to the things that exist beyond the machine itself. Past setup choices, earlier associations, information saved somewhere else, all of that can matter when the system has to decide whether it can return to a usable state. You only notice this when something breaks, because that's when Windows starts checking more than just what's on the device. What that changes in practice is how ownership works. You can own the hardware and still have to satisfy conditions before control is restored. Sometimes that's quick and painless. Sometimes it depends on details you haven't thought about in years, and you find yourself thinking, wait, why does this matter right now? From Microsoft's side, I get why this exists. For example, stalling devices are a real problem today. Data protection matters. Managing millions of machines is easier when they behave consistently. Windows 10 moved in that direction a bit, but it still leaned more heavily on local authority when recovery was needed, and it didn't reach outward as often because letting you take control again. The difference between those approaches doesn't show up when everything is working. Day-to-day use looks fine either way. You only run into it when the system has to rebuild or restored, and Windows needs to decide who is allowed to do that and under what condition. That's why reactions to these changes are all over the place. If you never hit that situation, none of this sounds real. If you have, you probably remember the moment clearly because the rules were not what you expected them to be. So the question that keeps coming up for me is simple, even if the answer isn't. When a computer stops working, should having the device in front of you be enough to regain control, or should the control depend on meeting requirements that live outside the machine? Windows 10 usually answers that locally. Windows now answers it with more condition attached, and that changes how control actually works when it matters the most. If your Windows PC works fine today, that doesn't mean any of this is theoretical. It just means you haven't run into the moments where these rules get tested. Resets, recoveries, reinstalls, hardware changes, those are the points where Windows has to decide who gets back in. If you had one of these experiences, I'd really like to hear about it. Please leave a comment below and say what happened, especially if it caught you off guard. And if you find this video useful and want to hear more like this, consider subscribing and enabling notifications. See you next time.